The body came in through the apothecary's back window at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, and Maren Gill, who had been grinding dried valerian root by lamplight and minding her own business, watched two men in dark coats lower it through the casement on a length of rope and drop it onto her workbench with no more ceremony than a sack of river sand. She did not scream. She had been the daughter of an apothecary before she had been the wife of one, and she had been the widow of one for 3 years since, and a woman who had spent the better part of her life in a room full of poisons and sharp instruments learned early that screaming was rarely the most useful first response to anything. She stepped back behind the tall cabinet where the tinctures were shelved, and she watched. The two men did not come in. They lowered the body to the bench. One of them leaned through the casement to be sure it had landed without noise. And then they were gone. The rope followed them up. The window, which she had left unlatched against the August heat, swung inward on its hinge and bumped the casement frame once and went still. She counted slowly to 30. Then she crossed the workroom with the lamp in her hand and looked at what they had left her. He was a man somewhere in his early 30s, she thought, though the bruising along his jaw made it difficult to be certain. He was on his back across the bench with one arm hanging over the side. His coat was good wool, deep green, the kind that was cut by a tailor who charged by the hour rather than by the job. His boots were Hobie's work, or something close to it. His cravat had been pulled loose, and there was a cut along his left temple that had bled freely down the side of his face, and dried there in a dark line. He was breathing. She checked that first before anything else the way her father had taught her. 2 fingers at the side of the throat. Pulse steady, a little fast, breathing shallow but even. He had not been dropped here to die. If they had wanted him dead, they had had ample opportunity before the rope. She did not yet know that he was the Earl of Ashwick. She did not yet know that the woman who had paid for the rope and the 2 coatless men was the widow of his older brother, or that the older brother had not died of a riding accident the way the inquest had recorded. She knew only that there was an unconscious gentleman on her workbench at 11:30 on a Tuesday in August, and that the cut on his temple needed cleaning, and that the smell coming off him was laudanum and something under the laudanum that was not gin. She knew that smell. She had been the daughter of an apothecary, and then the wife of one, and she had spent 11 years in rooms that smelled of exactly that. She got her hands under his shoulders and dragged him off the bench. She was not a large woman. She was 31 years old, and she was the daughter of a man who had believed that a woman who ran a dispensary had better be able to move what needed moving without stopping to ask for help. And she had forearms that could carry a full mortar without strain, and a back that had rolled 50-pound barrels of dried herbs up from the cellar stair without complaint. She got him off the bench and onto the floor, and she dragged him through the workroom door and into the small back room, where she kept the overnight cot for the nights when a labour went long and the midwife needed to rest between watches. She got him onto the cot. She lit the second lamp. Then she went back to the workroom and she washed her hands, and she brought the clean basin and the cloth and the small brown bottle of calendula wash, and she sat down on the stool beside the cot, and she cleaned the cut on his temple with the care she gave to everything she did in this room. His breathing steadied as she worked. The laudanum would work itself out. The thing under the laudanum concerned her more. She bent close and breathed in at his collar, the way her father had taught her, the way she had taught herself, the way she had learned not to explain to patients who watched her do it with baffled expressions. It was prussic acid, faint but there, already thinning. Not enough to kill, enough to incapacitate, to make the laudanum hit harder and faster, to put a man down for longer than laudanum alone would manage. Someone who knew their chemistry had wanted this man insensible for a specific number of hours. She sat back on the stool and looked at him in the lamplight and thought about what that meant. His coat had no signet ring on the hand. His pockets had been turned. There was nothing in the lining of the coat that she could find. Nothing at the wrist. Nothing at the collar. Whoever had sent him through the window had already taken whatever would identify him. She checked the inside breast pocket last, because it was the one most often missed by a hand searching in haste, and there she found it. A small rectangle of folded paper, not a card, but a handwritten note on expensive stock. The handwriting was a man's, quick and certain. It said, Ashwick, Tuesday. 11 o'clock. Come alone. She refolded the note. She set it on the stool beside her knee. She looked at the man on the cot. Ashwick. She knew the title. Everyone in this part of London knew the title because the Earl of Ashwick's older brother had died at the family's country house in Wiltshire 2 years ago, in what had been called a riding accident, and what half the county had whispered was something else entirely. The current Earl had come home from the continent after the inquest, and had, by all accounts, been quietly living in Grosvenor Square and not attending much of anything since, and now he was on her cot with prussic acid in his blood, and no identification in his pockets, and 2 men in dark coats who had not stayed to see whether he lived. She went to the workroom door and turned the bolt. She went to the back window and latched it. She pulled the shutter across the front window of the dispensary and shot the bar. She checked the front door. Then she came back to the stool beside the cot, and she put her hands flat on her knees, and she looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She had a dispensary. She had a set of scales that had belonged to her father before they had belonged to her husband, and she had 300 brown glass bottles arranged in the order she had arranged them since she was 9 years old, and she had a cot in the back room, and a lodging above the shop, and a neighbour's girl who came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to help with the grinding. She did not have a great deal else. She was not afraid of the man on the cot. She had been afraid of the 2 men who had dropped him through the window, which was a different thing entirely, and a much more sensible thing to be afraid of. She was a woman who ran an apothecary shop in a neighbourhood where the better sort and the worse sort lived within 4 streets of each other, and she had dispensed medicines to both for 11 years, and she had learned to read a situation the way she read a prescription, carefully, and with attention to what was not written down. What was not written down here was who had lured this man to a Tuesday night meeting and left him unconscious in a woman's dispensary with prussic acid in his blood. What was not written down was whether they would come back when the night's work was done to check that the work had held. What was not written down was why someone wanted the Earl of Ashwick incapacitated badly enough to arrange a handwritten note and a rope and 2 men in dark coats. She had a feeling she knew what the dispensary's back window had to do with it. This was not a random choice of window. Whoever had done this had known the window was unlatched. They had known she kept the dispensary unlocked at the back in summer. They had known the workroom was empty at 11 at night. They had chosen her window because they knew her habits. She sat with that thought for a while. Then she refilled the basin with fresh water, and she laid a cool cloth on his forehead, and she went upstairs to her own rooms, and she did not sleep. He came round before dawn. She heard him on the cot through the floor, the shift of weight, the short intake of breath that was a man rediscovering where he was. She came down the back stair with the lamp and the cup of willow bark tea she had already prepared, and she stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at him. He was sitting up on the edge of the cot with his head in both hands. He was a large man, and the cot had not been built for large men, and his knees were nearly at his chest. He looked in that moment not like an earl. He looked like a man who had been put through a hedge. He said, without lifting his head, "Where am I?" It was not quite a question. It was the voice of a man establishing facts. She said, "An apothecary's back room, Broad Street, off St. James's. You came through the window at 11:30. He lifted his head. His eyes were dark brown, she noted, not grey, and they were clear and taking her in with an alertness that suggested the laudanum had worked its way out of him faster than she had expected. He said, "I came through the window." She said, "You were lowered. There were 2 men. A rope." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long?" She said, 4.5 hours. Give or take. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the room. He said, "Are you the apothecary?" She said, "I am. My name is Maren Gill. My husband held this shop before me. Before him, my father. You are on the overnight cot, and there is willow bark tea on the stool. And you are welcome to the tea, but you are not welcome to leave until you can stand without assistance, because I have no intention of finding a man on my doorstep at dawn." He looked at her for a long time with those clear brown eyes, and she looked back and did not move. He said, "My name is," she said, "I know who you are." "The note in your breast pocket says Ashwick." He closed his eyes briefly. He said, "Of course it does." Then, "You know the smell of prussic acid." She said, "I have been in this room for 11 years. I know the smell of most things." She had not meant to echo anyone. She had simply been stating a fact. She said, "You were given laudanum cut with a small amount of prussic, not enough to kill, enough to make you unconscious quickly and keep you that way. Whoever mixed it knew what they were doing." He said, "How long will it take to clear?" She said, "It's largely cleared already. You'll have a headache for 2 days. The cut on your temple is clean." He reached up and touched the temple. He found the edge of the dressing she had put on it. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. I have questions," he said. "I imagine you do." She pulled the stool to the side of the cot and sat on it, and set the cup of tea where he could reach it. She said, "The note lured you to a meeting place. You were drugged in your cup and transported here. 2 men who knew the layout of my shop brought you through my back window, which means someone with knowledge of my habits is involved in this. I would like to know who. I would also like to know who sent the note." He looked at the cup. He picked it up and drank half of it without ceremony. He said, "The meeting was requested by a solicitor named Henley Dodd. He said he had information about my brother's estate." She said, "And instead?" He said, "Instead I remember a private room at a coffee house in Pall Mall, and then I remember nothing until this cot." She said, "Dodd." He said, "Francis Dodd's older brother. Francis was my brother's solicitor. Henley was." He stopped. He said, "He was also my brother's solicitor, before Francis took over the practice." She looked at him. She said, "Your brother who died in Wiltshire 2 years ago?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The inquest recorded a riding accident." He said, "The inquest recorded what it was given to record." She let the silence sit. She was good at silences. She had spent 11 years in a room where people told her things they had not meant to tell, because the small brown bottles on the shelves and the smell of dried herbs and the particular quality of quiet in a dispensary at dusk made people speak honestly. She waited. He said, after a long moment, "My brother's name was Pet. He was 3 years older than I am. He died in January 2 years ago. The inquest said he had been thrown from his horse on the east path of the Wiltshire house, and that his own gun had discharged in the fall. The surgeon who examined him submitted a report to the family. I read that report in February when I came home from Lisbon. The report said the wound was inconsistent with a fall." She said, "In what way?" He said, "The angle, the powder residue, the distance." She said, "You said this to the inquest." He said, "The inquest was closed before I read the report. It was closed in 3 days. I have been attempting to find the man who wrote the report for 2 years. He is a retired surgeon named Talmage. He moved to Edinburgh in the winter after the inquest, and I have not been able to locate him." She nodded slowly. She said, "And now Henley Dodd has sent you a note claiming to have information about your brother's estate, and you were drugged in your cup, and 2 men who know the back layout of my dispensary put you through my window." He said, "Yes," she said, "who stands to lose something if the surgeon's report becomes known?" He was quiet. He said, "My brother's widow. She inherits the entailed portion of the Wiltshire property under the marriage settlement. If Pet's death is ruled a murder, the settlement is voided and the property reverts." She said, "What is her name?" He said, "Isolde Vane." The name meant nothing to her immediately. She filed it. She said, "I know someone who may know where Talmage is." He looked at her. She said, "The pharmacist at the Royal College of Surgeons keeps a register of retired practitioners for the purpose of pension correspondence. He is an old acquaintance of my father's. I have filled his prescription for a lung complaint for 9 years. He will tell me what is in the register if I ask him directly, and I will ask him tomorrow morning." He stared at her. He said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because whoever chose my window knew my habits, and I would like to know who it was before they used that knowledge again." She stood up from the stool. She said, "You will stay in this room for the rest of tonight. In the morning you will tell me everything you know about Henley Dodd and Isolde Vane, and I will go to the college. You will not go back to Grosvenor Square until we know whether someone is watching the house. Do you understand?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Mrs. Gill." She said, "Yes." He said, "You have just told a peer of the realm to stay on a narrow cot in your back room," she said. "I have told a man who was unconscious on my workbench 4 hours ago to stay where it is safe until morning. I did not ask your title before I said it, and I do not require it now. Is that clear?" He said, "Yes." And then, very quietly, he said, "Thank you." She went back upstairs. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by her window with the lamp turned low, and she thought about Isolde Vane, and about Henley Dodd, and about who had known the back window was unlatched. There was a woman named Prue who came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help with the grinding. There was the boy who brought the dried stock from the wholesale yard on Monday mornings. There was the watchman who did the Broad Street round, and who had, on 3 occasions, tested her back window latch for her and reported its condition. There was also the woman who had come in 6 weeks ago for a compound for her nerves, an elegant woman in mourning grey who had asked careful questions about Maren's hours, and whether she kept the shop alone, and whether the neighbourhood was safe for a woman at night, and who had given a name that Maren had not thought to remember until this moment. She had given the name Vane. Maren sat with that for the remainder of the night. In the morning, he was standing at the workroom door when she came down. He had washed the blood from the side of his face at the basin, and he had straightened his coat, and his cravat was still loose, but he had run a hand through his hair, and he looked, in the thin morning light, like a man who had recovered faster than she had expected, which she attributed to constitution and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. He said, "I know who Isolde sent to my brother's study the night before he died." She said, "Tell me while I prepare the tincture for the college visit." He told her while she worked. He told her about a man named Gidding, a bailiff who had been in the employ of the Vane family for 12 years, and who had been released from service 6 months after Pet's death with a reference that should, by all rights, have been beyond the reach of a dismissed bailiff. He had traced Gidding to a lodging in Southwark 2 months ago, and had written to him twice with no reply. She listened and measured and wrote down the name. She went to the college at 9 in the morning. She was back before 11. She put the slip of paper with the Edinburgh address on the workbench, and she put her basket down and she said, "Talmage is at a lodging in the new town. He retired to Edinburgh, but he has been coming to London every autumn for the past 2 years to attend a lecture series at the medical school in Bloomsbury. He is expected in 4 weeks. He looked at the address. He said, 4 weeks. She said, or we send a letter today. He looked up at her. She said, I write a good letter. My father's clients were often in other cities, and I learned early that a letter that explains its purpose clearly and completely in the first paragraph is more likely to receive a reply than one that does not. She pulled out the stool and sat down. She said, Tell me what Talmage needs to know, and I will write it. He said, You don't know me. She said, I know you were put through my window with prussic acid in your blood, and I know your brother's widow visited this dispensary 6 weeks ago and asked questions about my hours. I know enough. He sat down on the other stool across the bench from her, and he told her what Talmage needed to know. She wrote it. She wrote 3 drafts before she was satisfied with the first paragraph, and she crossed out 2 sentences in the third that she felt overstated the urgency in a way that might alarm a cautious man into silence. When she was done, she read it aloud to him, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only, Yes. She sealed it. She sent it by the afternoon post. The reply came in 11 days. It came not to the dispensary, but to the college pharmacist, who brought it round in person with an expression that suggested he had been curious about its contents since it arrived. She thanked him at the door and brought it upstairs and read it at the table. Then she went down to the back room, where the Earl of Ashwick had been sleeping on the narrow cot for 11 days, and eating the meals she brought him, and sitting at the workbench in the late afternoons, reading the pharmaceutical texts she had given him, because he had asked for something to read, and she had not had novels. She had found, over 11 days, that he was a man who read carefully and asked specific questions. He had asked her about the properties of compound tinctures, and about the chemistry of prussic acid, and about the difference between a diagnostic poison and a therapeutic one. He had asked her about her father and about her husband, and about why she had stayed in the shop after her husband died when she might have sold it. She had told him the truth, which was that the shop was hers in a way nothing else had been, and that she had not seen any reason to give it to a stranger. He had looked at her when she said that with an expression she had not been able to read at the time. She looked at it now as she set the letter on the bench in front of him. He read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a long moment with his jaw set and his hands flat on the bench. She said, "He will come. He says in the letter he has been waiting 2 years for someone to ask." She said, "Yes," he said. "He says he submitted the report to the family solicitor. He says he was told it had been forwarded to the inquest." She said, "And it had not been." He said, "No." He looked at her. He said, "The solicitor the family used at the time of the inquest was Henley Dodd." The room was quiet. She could hear the street outside, the cart traffic, the particular sounds of Broad Street in the late morning. She said, "Then Dodd suppressed the report. And when you began looking for Talmage 2 years later, Dodd told Isolde. And Isolde arranged a note in Dodd's name and 2 men and a rope." He said, "And my window," she said, "your window." She put her hands on the bench. "Talmage will come to London in 3 weeks. When he does, he needs to go directly to the Bow Street magistrate, not to a solicitor, not to the family, to the magistrate directly." He said, "I know the sitting magistrate. He is an honest man." She said, "Good. Then I will write to Gidding." He looked at her. She said, "The bailiff in Southwark, who did not reply to your letters, he did not reply because he is afraid. He will reply to a letter from an apothecary on Broad Street, who says she has been asked to look into a matter of a compound prescription issued in the week before Lord Ashwick's death. He will reply because he will not know what I know, and will wonder what I might say." He stared at her. He said, "That is not entirely honest." She said, "It is not entirely dishonest either. I do have an interest in a compound issued in that period. I have a strong interest in who compounded the prussic acid that went into your cup." He was quiet. Then he said, "Mrs. Gill," she said, "yes." He said, "I have been sleeping on your cot for 11 days and eating your bread and reading your father's pharmaceutical texts. I have given you nothing in return for any of it," she said. "You have answered my questions about Grosvenor Square drainage, which I had been wondering about since the spring. That was useful." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she had seen it move in 11 days, and she noted it the way she noted everything in this room, which was carefully. He said, "Write to Gidding." She wrote the letter that afternoon. She wrote it in the careful, neutral tone she used for letters about sensitive prescriptions, and she sent it to the Southwark address he gave her, and she did not expect a fast reply. The reply came in 4 days. Gidding came in person. He came to the dispensary door on a Thursday morning when the neighbour's girl was in the back doing the grinding, and Maren brought him through to the small sitting room at the side of the shop and gave him tea and listened. He was a man of 50 or so, with the look of someone who had not slept well in 2 years. He sat on the edge of the chair and held the cup in both hands, and he said that he had been in Lord Ashwick's study on the night of January the 4th, and that he had not been there at his own initiative. He had been sent there by Isolde Vane, who had given him a key and told him to take a particular set of letters from the desk drawer and burn them in the grate and tell no one. He said he had burned the letters. He said he had read enough of them before the burning to understand what they contained. He said they were letters between the late Lord Ashwick and a woman in Bath, and that the woman in Bath had been writing to him about money, and that the nature of the money suggested that the late Lord Ashwick had been paying her for something specific and had stopped paying 2 months before his death. He did not know the woman's name. The letters had been signed only with an initial. He said Isolde Vane had paid him £50 for the burning, and he had taken it, and he had not slept easily since. Maren said, "Will you put that in a statement?" He said, "If it keeps me off the dock." Yes, she wrote his statement herself. She wrote it at the dispensary bench with him sitting across from her, and she read it back to him when she was done, and he made 2 corrections, and then he signed it. She witnessed it. She sent the neighbour's girl to fetch the Bow Street constable, who did the neighbourhood round, and the constable came within the hour and signed it as a second witness, and when it was done, he looked at her with the expression men often wore when they found she had already arranged more than they had expected. She did not explain herself. She never did. He came down from the back room while the constable was still at the dispensary door. He had heard enough through the floor to understand. He stood in the workroom with the constable's eye on him and his own eye on the signed statement, and he was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Gidding." Gidding looked at the floor. The constable went. Gidding went shortly after. Maren bolted the front door and stood in the quiet of the dispensary and let her shoulders down. He came out of the workroom and stood in the doorway between the shop and the back hall. He said, "Talmadge arrives in 2 weeks. The magistrate has been informed. Dodd has been asked not to leave London," she said, "and Isolde." He said, "She is at the Wiltshire house. She does not yet know how far the chain has reached." He paused. "She will know soon," she said. "When she does," he said, "she will come to London. She always comes to London when she is cornered. She will go to her family's solicitor in Gray's Inn. When she does, the magistrate will want to see her." She nodded. She said, "Then we have 2 weeks." He said, "Yes, and then Maren." She looked at him. He had not used her given name in 11 days. He had been careful with it, the same way he had been careful not to take up too much space in her workroom, not to ask for more than she offered, not to look at her for longer than courtesy required. She had noted all of it, the same way she noted everything, and she had not said anything about it. She looked at him now. He said, "I don't know how to do this correctly. I am aware that I am standing in your dispensary having imposed on your hospitality and your expertise and your postal accounts for 11 days. And I am aware that what I am about to say is being said at the wrong time in the wrong room and probably in the wrong way." She said nothing. She waited. He said, "When this is finished, when Talmadge has been to the magistrate and the statement is on the table and Isolde is where she belongs, I would like to call on you, not as a matter of debt, not because I owe you, which I do considerably, because I have spent 11 days in this room watching you run a business and compound tinctures and write letters that say in 1 paragraph what other people cannot say in 4, and I have not been able to find a reason why I would not want to call on you for the rest of the available years." The dispensary was very quiet. She could hear the street outside. She could hear the sound of the grinding in the back, the steady rhythm of the neighbour's girl with the mortar, which had been the rhythm of this room since she was 9 years old. She said, "That is a great deal to say." He said, "I am aware of that." She said, "You are an Earl," he said. "Yes," she said, "I compound medicines for a living." He said, "I know. I have been watching you do it for 11 days. She said, "I will not give up the shop." He said, "I wouldn't ask you to." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Call on me then, when it's finished." He let out a breath she had not realized he was holding. She went back to the bench and picked up the pestle, and the conversation was over for now, and neither of them said anything more about it for the 2 weeks that remained. Talmadge came to London on a Wednesday in late September. He was a small man of 70, with a methodical voice and a leather case that he carried himself and would not let anyone else touch. He went directly to the Bow Street magistrate's office, as Maren had arranged. He sat in the witness chair and he opened the case, and he laid the surgeon's original report on the table, the full report. The one Dodd had told Isolde had been forwarded to the inquest and had not. The magistrate read it. He read it twice, the same way the Earl had read Talmadge's letter. Then he looked up. Dodd was brought in within the hour. He said nothing useful, but the saying of nothing useful, in a room with a 30-year surgical report and a signed statement from a Southwark bailiff and a Bow Street magistrate who had been practising his profession for 22 years, was itself a form of saying something. Isolde Vane arrived in London 3 days later, as the Earl had predicted. She came to Gray's Inn to see her family solicitor. The constable was waiting. She was a striking woman. Maren saw her once, in the anteroom of the magistrate's office, on the morning the formal charges were read. She was in black, the good morning black of someone who wore it as armour rather than grief, and her face was composed in a way that suggested she had been composing it for 2 years. She did not look at the Earl. She looked at the magistrate and then at the table, and then, for one brief moment, at Maren. She did not look away immediately. She looked at Maren with a long measuring look, The same look she had given her in the dispensary 6 weeks ago when she had asked about the hours and the neighbourhood and the back window. And then the magistrate spoke, and she looked away, and Maren did not see her face again. The charges were read. The matter was committed to trial. The Earl of Ashwick walked out of Bow Street into a grey October morning with his jaw set and his hands in his pockets and his brother's name, finally, on a magistrate's record, as a man who had been murdered rather than a man who had fallen. Maren walked beside him. She had a basket on her arm because she had planned to stop at the wholesale yard on the way back, and she was a woman who did not see the point in making 2 trips. He looked at the basket, he looked at her, he said, "Is that for the yard on Floral Street?" She said, "Yes," he said, "I'll walk with you." She said, "I know." They walked. The morning was cold and the street was full of the ordinary noise of London in autumn, and neither of them said anything for a block. Then she said, "You'll need a new solicitor." He said, "I already have one. Dodd's former He's been suspicious of the practice for a year." She said, "Good." He said, "Talmage has agreed to present the full report to the Royal College in the spring." She said, "He should. It's important work." He said, "Gidding is going back to Lincolnshire. I've arranged a position for him there." She said, "That was decent." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I meant what I said. 2 weeks ago." She said, "I know you did." He said, "I am not a man who says things he does not mean." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Then." She stopped at the corner of Floral Street and looked at him. He was watching her with the same directness he had turned on her in the back room at 5 in the morning, when he had been a man working out where he was, and she had been a woman working out what to do about it. She had liked him then, before she knew his name or his title or what it was that had gotten him dropped through her window. She had liked the way he had counted his facts before he spoke them. She said, "Call on me on Thursday. I'll be in by 3. The neighbour's girl leaves at 2 and I grind the evening compounds after she goes. So come at 3 and I'll set the bench clear, and you can tell me the rest of it," he said. "The rest of what?" She said. "You haven't told me about your brother yet." "Not really. You've told me facts about him. You haven't told me who he was." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Thursday at 3. She said, "Yes." And she went into the wholesale yard on Floral Street with her basket, and he waited at the door without being asked. And when she came out, he carried the basket to the corner of Broad Street and handed it back and went on toward Grosvenor Square without looking back, and she let herself into the dispensary and stood in the quiet of her own shop for a moment before she set the basket down and went to the bench. 12 months later, in the October of the following year, the dispensary on Broad Street was doing what it had always done on a Tuesday morning, which was grinding. The neighbour's girl had been replaced by a young woman of 17 who was quick with numbers and who was learning the stock, and she was at the bench with the mortar when Maren came downstairs with ink on her left hand from the letter she had been writing at the desk in the upper rooms, which was a letter to the Royal College regarding a new compound she had been developing for a particular type of lung complaint that she thought had been undertreated in the literature. The girl looked at the ink on her hand, and then at the counter, and then back to her work without comment, because she had been working in the dispensary for 4 months, and she had learned already that Mrs. Gill, or the Countess of Ashwick as she was listed in the professional register, was not a woman who observed the expected distinctions between the shop floor and the social register when she was in the middle of a project. The sign above the dispensary door on Broad Street still read Gill's Dispensary, Est, 1799, because the Countess had asked to have it left, and her husband had agreed without being asked twice. The pharmaceutical library in the study at Grosvenor Square now held, in addition to the Earl's considerable collection of estate records and political correspondence, a complete set of her father's annotated dispensaries and a row of her own working notebooks, and she worked from both locations on alternating days. She had not sold the shop. She had no intention of selling the shop. In the drawing room of the Grosvenor Square house, on the mantelpiece, in a plain frame of no particular distinction, hung the letter she had written to Talmage in the first week of his 11 days on the cot. She had not meant for it to be framed. She had found it on the mantelpiece one morning, with a frame around it, and a note in his handwriting tied it beside that said only, First paragraph. Still the best. On the writing desk in the upper room of the dispensary, there was a small glass bottle, empty now with a card tucked under its base. The card said prussic acid in her own handwriting, which was the label she had written on the night he had come through the window when she had been trying to identify what she was smelling. She had kept it because it was the night she had known for certain that she was not afraid of the situation, only of the men in dark coats, and that had struck her afterward as the most clarifying thing she had understood about herself in years. The front bell of the dispensary rang. The girl went to answer it. Maren did not look up from the mortar. She heard his voice at the door, asking whether she was in the back. The girl said yes. He came through the shop the way he had learned to come through it over the past 12 months, which was without ceremony, and he stopped at the workroom door and looked at her at the bench. She said, without looking up, "Tuesday's grinding day." He said, "I know. I brought the letter from Talmadge," she said. "Leave it on the bench." He left it on the bench. He did not leave. He stayed in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her work for a moment. He said, "The spring presentation at the college is confirmed. They want you to present the lung compound alongside him." She looked up at that. He said, "I told them I would ask." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, you'll present." She said, "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved. She had become familiar with that particular movement over the past 12 months, what preceded it and what followed it, but she had not stopped noticing it. She went back to the mortar. Outside, Broad Street was doing what it did on a Tuesday morning in October, which was existing without any particular drama, full of the ordinary noise of a city going about its work. Inside the dispensary, the bottles stood in their rows in the order she had arranged them. Since she was 9 years old, the pestle turned. The compound came together in the bowl, a little at a time, the way everything in this room came together. By attention and patience, and a thorough understanding of what each element was for.